This is the second conference, as you heard. The first one took place a year ago, also in Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, at the attack base of the Azov of National Corps movement, as an initiator of the all-European network movement of Reconquista, aimed at coordination of European nations, and aimed at coordination of their cooperation, as you understood. The end goal of such a cooperation is the creation of a Pan-European, all-European Union, or simply Paneuropa. When we mention Paneuropa, of course we differentiate it from the so-called Coudenhove-Kalergi plan. Paneuropa, different doctrines of European unity, they are originally European. They rooted in our medieval history and even prior to it. They were developed in the 19th century when geopolitics emerged as a discipline. They flourished in the 20th century. The renaissance of pan-European ideas, doctrines, happened in the aftermath of the Second World War. There are many different versions of pan-European unity, historical ones, properly geopolitical ones, and those which relate to the history of the so-called Third Way or Conservative Revolution. The theorists who developed those doctrines after First World War, the luminaries of this third positionist movement, also called third position, third way, like Ernst Junger, Julius Evola, Pierre de La Rochelle, Oswald Mosley, understand that United States, so-called West, and the Russian Federation as an heir of Soviet Union are two superpowers which shape the so-called New World Order. So of course it's ridiculous to believe that one of them suddenly became truly pro-European and European. Many sympathizers of the tactical and even strategical essential, I would say, alliance with the Russian Federation believe that in fact now we live in the reality of the so-called one polar world. All of you, of course, now remember words of Alexander Dugin and intellectuals like him. He contends that now we live under conditions of one world hegemon, United States. Russia is no longer hegemon, so Russia is our friend. But of course, the geopolitical reality says that the situation is different. It's not a tragedy, or not only a tragedy, it's also a window of opportunity, not only for Ukraine, for Eastern Europe, Central Europe, but also for all of the Western world, because neither our liberal government, which is just a puppet government, nor Western superpowers, they are not able to fight with us, because otherwise they will give a favor to their geopolitical rival.
They don't have in their genetics the values of the fascism that in Italy represent the real values of the Italian nation. I'm not here talking about my ideology. Fascism, you have to understand that fascism in Italy is not something belong just in the political field. It's a phenomenon, political, social phenomenon, an historical one, that build up our nation. So it's unavoidable in the analysis of our nation building. So you have to understand that by the historical point, fascism is the terminal part of our nation building. So we complete the conquer of our border, and then the veterans from the First World War create this form of government to complete our historical and our historical mission. So anyway, it's central for our life. So today we're in the situation that we have this new phenomenon, this new monster, this new democratic party called Lega Nord. It's a very strange situation because Salvini, of course, Salvini is the famous leader, the frontman of Lega Nord, is against the immigration, and it's also stopped one NGO, the Soros NGO boat, maybe you heard about just one. But it's not a real nationalist, it's not a real revolutionary, have no revolutionary culture behind it. It's very often, it's improvisation or political intuition, but they don't lead a real alternative.
The second problem, which might be perhaps an even bigger problem, is the loss and lack of identity. And what I mean by that is, if you have a tree, you cut its roots, it can't grow back. And if you have people who are not identifying themselves as Swedish, they're identifying themselves as something completely else. They identify as the globalist monoculture, where they can buy an identity and they don't really have any roots. And therefore, if you say to them, you know what, Sweden will cease existing, Europe will cease existing, they will say, why would I care about that? I'm a citizen of the world, as long as I can have my alcohol and porn and drugs and all these distractions. So that is a very hard question to reach, because as long as we have this sort of luxurious society still, it's quite easy for these people to take that road. Why would I care about the fate of Sweden or the West if I don't even feel part of it? So that is a huge issue in the salvation of both Sweden and in Europe and the West in general, the revival of our identity. And obviously history comes into a large role in here. And this leads me to my next question, and that is the one of ancient rivalries and chauvinism. Now obviously, understanding European history, we know we have had a lot of brutal and bloody wars between each other. And this is obviously something that can be approached in two different ways. We can take the conflict between England and Ireland, it goes back 800 years. If Irish identitarians can draw strength from the fortitude shown by their ancestors, then that is perfect. That is a good aspect of these ancient rivalries, if that can increase your sense of identity. However, if we allow that to go too far and we start bicker amongst each other and harbor resentments against each other going forward, then our enemies' work will be much easier for them, because, as I said, they view Europe as one entity. The same plan applies for everyone. A few notes on NATO and Russia and the Intermarium projects. So the main thing here is to take our own side, because we've had this argument as well in Sweden, you know, okay, we have Putin here, we have NATO and EU there, so we have to choose, but we don't really have to choose. If we can build a bloc of Eastern and Central European nations that are strong in their own right, who reject Russian imperialism and who reject neoliberalism emanating from EU and NATO, yeah, then we'll be in a much better position. So I am all for the Intermarium idea. I'm all for a closer cooperation between the states of Eastern Europe. It's my sincere hope that many of the ancient rivalries can be put aside and look towards the future, because right now Poland and Hungary, they are holding up quite well against the EU, and the more people who can join them, the better. If we had a bloc consisting of more nations who are saying the same thing and rejecting EU, yeah, they're strengthening numbers, and that applies both against the EU and against Russia. So it's an absolutely brilliant idea, Intermarium, and I will definitely keep my eyes open for that, and I hope for the best in that particular endeavor. Thank you.
And because of the reaction to Plan A, the establishment has been formulating Plan B. And Plan B is being formulated by people like Francis Fukuyama and other people who are in the United States known as neoconservatives. And what Plan B is a way of preserving the existing power structure in America and the West, to preserve it against the rise of white identity politics, to preserve it against the rise of nationalism and populism, by promoting a somewhat more conservative and somewhat more inclusive form of civic nationalism. And that's really what the agenda of Fukuyama's book Identity is. It's to keep the existing establishment in power by putting on the brakes slightly, by slowing the process down slightly, because they realize that if the establishment keeps its foot on the brakes, keeps pushing multiculturalism and open borders, that there is going to be a reaction, and that reaction might sweep them out of power. The opening sentence of Fukuyama's book is basically, this book never would have been written if Donald Trump had not been elected president of the United States. That was a wake-up call. That was a scary thing. Brexit happened, I remember when Brexit happened, my mother was in Europe, and she was talking to some typical liberal English woman, and they were in Denmark actually, and this woman was just shocked, and she said, if Brexit can happen, Trump can get elected. And if Trump can get elected, Le Pen can get elected. That was the panic, that was the fear. Brexit happening made it possible, made it conceivable for Trump, and made a lot of other things. Right? And he doesn't give us any indication of what this basically synthetic, fake culture is going to be. He says it's not enough just to have people raise their hand and take an oath that they're going to be Americans. There has to be something more to that. There has to be a culture that we have in common. What sort of culture that will be, again, besides burritos and hip hop, is entirely empty. It's and the underlying assumption here, and he makes this very explicit. He says the error that the identitarians of the right make is to assume that identity is somehow given to you by your biology or your heredity, when it's really not. We can have all kinds of identities. He basically has to embrace a completely social constructivist notion of identity. Why? Because the thing that's going to save America from our kind of identity politics is for the establishment to construct a fake liberal democratic identity politics. And there's no indication, though, of what the content of that liberal democratic identity politics is going to be. So, this is the best that the neocons have come up with so far.
And our fight is essentially a spiritual fight. What is most lacking in Europe, especially in Western Europe today, it is not only culture, but on a deeper spiritual level. We are lacking a religion. We are lacking a spirituality that permeates our society. And in the general opinion of the general public, is a strong desire to preserve our national independence. We voted against the European Union twice. However, Norwegian nationalism and patriotism is contradictory. Patriotism in Norway and loyalty to its own is mostly based on opposition against an outer force and not towards a positive self-assertion. Like compared to other nations in Europe, they want to a great degree, German nationalism, they wanted to assert the glory of the German culture, of the German identity. Norwegian patriotism has always been against an outer force trying to take our independence away from us. This is rooted in our history. Today, our patriotism is based in resistance against the German occupation during the Second World War. And after the war, a liberal patriotism, closely linked to civic nationalism, was created by the social democrats and the social liberals that hold power after the war. And to a certain extent, this patriotism has emasculated the patriots among the boomer generation. This mindset is the greatest challenge we have to overcome in the ideologies of the right. And I believe this is not true just for Norway, but this is true for many Western countries. The Norwegian identity and Norwegian nationalism and patriotism as a reaction to an outer force. It has its roots in that we spent and we suffered a union with Denmark for more than 400 years. And immediately that was followed by another union with Sweden for about 100 years. So intuitively, us Norwegians, we can understand the ethnic and cultural nuances. Intuitively, we can understand the difference that you find between closely related groups, as is the case, for example, with Ukrainians and Russians. We can relate to this because Norwegians had to build an identity opposed to the Swedes, which is basically almost the same people as us. From the outside, we look identical, almost. But to a Norwegian, we know that this is a big difference. So in this way, we can relate to what is going on in this nation building that is taking part here in Ukraine. So, but once you have a robust foundation, once you have built solid structures of state and identity, you can mature your relation. Norway matured their relation with Sweden and Denmark, which used to be nations that occupied Norway. And I believe the same may be possible in the future, 50, maybe 100 years from now, between Ukrainians and Russians. So we can end a necessary conflict between brothers. Now, geopolitically, there will be tension, but it can be tension solved in good faith between brother people. I'm giving this to you to consider. Now, this may be very difficult in the present state, but I'm giving it voice anyway. Nowadays, despite Sweden's problems, Norway and Sweden, we are the best of friends, actually. And we are natural allies and partners in many questions. And the Nordic Council is an example of how independent countries and independent states and nations can cooperate on common issues of common interest. They may crush and destroy any one individual, any one of them that might isolate and take. But banding together, forming a wall of shields and spears, we will not break. We will only grow stronger. Picking up the torch, we will carry the flame all the way to Olympus, all the way to victory. And we will remember those gone before us. We will carve out a destiny for those coming after us, forming a link to eternity, going all the way back to Godhead, going back to the sun behind the sun. Thank you very much.
I stand here on behalf of National Corps, the vanguard of European Reconquista. Reconquista is the movement that will build Paneuropa. So let's go to action.